Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Dan Rodney and I am an instructor at Noble Desktop, and I teach a bunch of the Adobe programs as well as other stuff that we offer here. And tonight we are going to be talking about Photoshop, getting you started in Photoshop. And in this slide deck here, I'm just going to go over what are we going to talk about tonight. So we are going to cover what Photoshop can do. A lot of people don't realize all the various different things that Photoshop can actually do. And so we want to cover all those just so you are aware of how flexible Photoshop is. It's not just for photo editing. Quickly talk about which Creative Cloud plan you should purchase, because to get Photoshop, you have to have a Creative Cloud plan. So in case some of you are interested in getting Photoshop, but you don't have it, we'll quickly cover just there's a couple plans to choose from. So which one should you choose? It won't take long to cover that, and a tutorial showing you how to start using Photoshop. So we'll go over Photoshop basics and cover some of the fundamental concepts to get you started using Photoshop. And then, of course, ways to continue learning, because we can't cover everything Photoshop has to offer in this limited time here. But we can at least get you started so you can do a few things with Photoshop. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Noble Desktop, we do training. Right now, because of COVID, we're doing everything online, but we're based in New York City, and we've been teaching for the past 30 years. So we've been teaching Photoshop for almost the entire time it's been out. And so we teach this stuff, and we're going to get you started tonight and teach you something about Photoshop. So what exactly can Photoshop do? And let's go through some of these things so that we can kind of see some of these things in action. We won't see all of these things tonight, but Photoshop does a lot more than what people think, I think. Of course, it is Photoshop, so it is for photo editing. You can crop photos, you can change their color, remove color casts that you don't like, and change the color to create a certain mood if you want it cool or warm, create a funky feeling. Whatever it is you're trying to bring out. You can retouch, remove elements you don't want. You can put photos together and composite multiple photos into a single new photo. To, let's say you take pictures of people and there's 3 different photos and there's 3 people, and in each different photo there's a good face, but you don't have one photo where everybody has a good face. Well, you can take their 3 different faces and put them together and composite them into a single image. All sorts of creative effects can be done. So you can blur backgrounds, you can create illustrations, you can do so many different things. You could do from simple things like I said, just blurring a background, to much more creative things of putting things together and creating like other worlds and doing designs within a photo. So there's the photo editing side, but Photoshop does more than just the photo editing side. There's also a whole design side to Photoshop as well. So a lot of designers use Photoshop because it's a pixel-based graphic tool. That is pixel-based editing as well as pixel-based design. So you can design and create graphics for websites, for social media, for email marketing, for designing an app. What is the app going to look like? What is the website going to look like? You can do print design in it. Basically anything where you're working with text and graphics, Photoshop can do a lot of that stuff. Now, sometimes there's going to be more appropriate programs, like if you're doing a multi-page document, InDesign would be better for that. If you're doing logos and drawings, Illustrator would be better for that. But Photoshop is very versatile and can do a wide variety of different graphic design type projects. You can create patterns. Photoshop has a pattern maker built in. So whether that's for graphics, like backgrounds of a web page, backgrounds in an app, for fashion designers will create patterns and use it in their fabrics. So Photoshop can do patterns. You can even animate. So you can create simple animated GIFs for emails, for social media, for email, the email marketing. Animated GIFs are huge in emails. If you want to animate in an email, animated GIF is the way to do it. So Photoshop is great at creating simple little animated GIFs. If you need to do more animation than what you can do in Photoshop, because Photoshop is more geared for the simple types of animation, you can take and design a graphic in Photoshop using its tools and then take that into other Adobe programs like After Effects. And After Effects is great for doing really complex animations. So you can design your graphic in Photoshop where it's easier to design, and then go to After Effects and animate that. So you can import Photoshop files into After Effects. And believe it or not, Photoshop can even do minor video editing. Now, even though it can do basic video editing, that is not its strong suit. Really, something like Adobe Premiere Pro is much better suited for that. So, but the idea of, you're like, why did they put video editing tools in Photoshop? I think of Photoshop as like the Swiss Army knife of Adobe apps. Over the years, just so many people learned Photoshop and they knew Photoshop, and they're like, hey, I wish Photoshop could do this, or I wish they could do this. And so over 30 years, some 30 plus years of development, Adobe just keeps throwing different features in there. And so when you're first learning Photoshop, you probably don't need all of these things right away. And to be honest, most people don't need all of these things. But they're not made that everybody needs everything in Photoshop. You just focus on the part that you want to learn and focus on what you need. If you're a photographer, learn the photo editing side. If you're a designer, learn the design side. If you're a fashion designer, learn the stuff specific to fashion design like patterns. If you're doing marketing, learn the design and the animation side. So don't feel like you have to learn everything in Photoshop. I firmly believe that no single person knows everything in Photoshop, knows every technique, every single thing you can do. Just when you think you know all of Photoshop, you see the tools that you know put together in a different way that you didn't think about before. So it's very flexible. You can use it in many different ways, and don't let that discourage you. Let it encourage you that you can get a lot out of this program, and that for years to come, you can keep growing into it and learning new things, and it can do a lot of different things for you. And as your needs grow, Photoshop will help you to do this. Now, with something like video editing, of course, you're like, why did they bother adding video editing to Photoshop? It was because if somebody knew Photoshop, like a photographer, and wanted to do a quick little video, maybe for social media or something, they didn't have to learn a whole other program like Premiere. Granted, Premiere Pro is going to be much better for video editing than a photo editor, but for a photographer that already knows Photoshop, that just wants to do a little bit of video and quickly export something and just wants to get it done without having to learn a whole program, they put a couple basic video features in there. So that's why Photoshop has so many different areas. It's not that they have to be the best in all of those areas. They just have them to be helpful for the people that want to do maybe a little bit of something in Photoshop. So let's see some examples of different things you can do, and then we'll get to the point where I'll actually show how to do some of these things. I'm not going to show everything tonight here because we do have limited time. Retouching. So you can go in, and we have a before and an after here. The original had some bright spots in the image that we didn't really particularly like. So you can go in there and you can get rid of spots that you don't like. Get rid of those unwanted areas. So there's tools to do that. We teach how to do this in our Photoshop in a Day and longer Photoshop bootcamp classes. There is color adjustment. Now, in this case, one way or the other, there's the technically correct color, and then there's the what do I feel like I want the color to be. So in the beginning, it was very warm and kind of reddish, and technically speaking, the koalas are actually gray. So the warm reddish initial color wasn't correct, and so we corrected it to be a more neutral gray in the after image. But that said, you don't always have to be like officially correct, proper color. When you think about platforms like Instagram, which got popular from all sorts of funky filters, which don't look like normal life. A lot of movies don't look like normal real life. They have a certain color aesthetic. We often like to create a feeling with our color and contrast and how an image looks. So you can go for realism, true proper color, or you can skew it in any way that you want and go for a certain feeling. So you can change the color and the contrast of photos. You can do special effects. In this case, it was just a simple thing of blurring the wheels so it looks like they're spinning. So both of the wheels start to blur, and also blurring the background so it looks like it was moving as well. And by the way, these are animated GIFs created in Photoshop. So the animated GIFs were actually built in Photoshop, showing examples of things built in Photoshop, which is kind of funny. Let's go on here. So moving on from photography to design, you can also design for all different types of things, such as social media, marketing, graphics, whether it's digital, print. You can combine text that you create in Photoshop. You can take images. If you need to retouch them, color correct them, you can work with them. You can bring in logos and vector artwork from Adobe Illustrator, bring that in, combine it all together, export the final image to upload to social media or to print or put on a website, whatever it is you want to do. So design is another thing that Photoshop can do. Here's just another example of a social media graphic where the background image was maybe it was a color image that was converted into black and white with this color applied to kind of tie into the color scheme of this graphic. So the graphic was brought in, the type was added, some drop shadows were added. So this could be designed in Photoshop as well. Animated GIFs. As I said before, animated GIFs are super popular in email. So marketing people that want to get into social media, emails, to do simple animated GIFs, you can build those up in Photoshop. This is an example of like a frame by frame style animation where you show one picture, show another picture, show another picture. Other types of animations could be not just so like kind of static, like picture, picture, picture. For example, if I go back over to our class page here and look at some of the projects here. So it could be like showing text that goes through, simple basic kind of thing, or you can do more complex type animations, and these can be animated GIFs, and you can build these up in Photoshop. Again, another animated GIF here of things moving in and out. This is a little more complex because you got to move it in a certain path to go in there. And then here you can actually even bring in video, because remember how I said you could do video stuff in Photoshop? You can actually even take a video, bring it in, and then export that as an animated GIF, because videos don't work as well in emails, but animated GIFs do. So you can even bring in videos and turn those into animated GIFs. Now, if you do want to create crazier animations, more complex animations, you're going to hit a point where Photoshop isn't the best choice for that. After Effects is better for more complex animations. But then you can design the thing in Photoshop and then take it over into After Effects to do the animations. So it can still integrate Photoshop with After Effects. And here's just another example. This we actually do in our After Effects class. We laid this design out in Photoshop, and then we brought it into After Effects and did the animation. So we had the type fall in, the icons slide over, the in a day slide over, and so all of that was initially designed as a static image in Photoshop, then taken into After Effects and animated. So it's just an example of a workflow. If you're an animator and you're going to work in something like After Effects, a lot of designers don't know After Effects, they don't know to animate, they also don't know to design. So it's more likely that a designer would know Photoshop or Illustrator, and they can design the graphic there and then take that into After Effects for further animation. Here's an example of a responsive website that has been designed in Photoshop. Now, Photoshop has been used and is continued to be used by a lot of designers that already know Photoshop to design websites or applications, but there are newer, better design tools to design websites. Adobe XD was created by Adobe as a new design tool for website design, app design. Adobe XD is kind of Adobe's version of Sketch, which is made by a different company. So apps like Adobe XD, Sketch, those are better used for designing websites these days. But a lot of people know Photoshop, and a lot of people use what they know. So there's been a lot of websites designed in Photoshop, and people continue to design websites in Photoshop. This is an example of how it would look on a phone, a tablet, and a desktop. So you can mock up how this stuff looks across different screen sizes. You can optimize the graphics. So Photoshop is definitely capable of designing websites, but what it can't do is things like good UX design, because it doesn't have any prototyping tools built into it. Now, you can take your designs into something else like InVision to do the prototyping, but as far as a workflow goes, it's better to use an integrated design tool like Adobe XD or Sketch. Like within Adobe XD, you can design, you can do your different screen size designs, and then you can also prototype and even animate all within one design tool rather than using Photoshop to do that. So, can you do web design in Photoshop? Yes, we teach how to do that. That's one of the classes, but we also teach Adobe XD and Sketch, and I would definitely encourage, if you're getting into web design, learn one of the proper web design tools like Adobe XD or Sketch, and use Photoshop for the graphics. As a web designer, I'm still going to use Photoshop to do the retouching and graphics that support that. So I'm going to retouch my photos, I'm going to color correct them, and then take them into Adobe XD. So Photoshop still is part of the web design workflow, but I wouldn't be mainly using it as my main web design tool unless you're working at a company that is already using Photoshop and that's currently what they're using, and you just want to fit into that workflow. But Adobe XD and Sketch are better modern choices for web design and app design programs. So that's kind of an overview of things that you can do in Photoshop. Before we get to our live demonstration of using Photoshop, I do want to cover just quickly the different Creative Cloud plans, because if you don't have Photoshop already, or maybe even if you did and you were confused by the plans, I just want to cover that. So when you go to renew, if you already have one, you can make sure you get the right plan. And if you're choosing to get Photoshop in the first place, make sure you get the right plan. So there's something called the photography plan, and if you get the photography plan, and I'm going to bring up a list, I'll show you the different plans you can choose from. Adobe has a comparison between them. But the photography plan, you actually get 3 apps. You get Adobe Photoshop, and you get 2 Lightroom apps. There's Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. So what's the deal? Why do they have 2 different ones? Well, Lightroom Classic is the first original version, and it's used by a lot of photographers. It's the older and more capable program. Lightroom is a newer, simpler app that kind of started over from scratch again. The big difference is that the new Lightroom, so it used to be that Lightroom Classic was simply called Lightroom. And then they wanted to use the Lightroom name for the newer app. So the newer app took the Lightroom name and they renamed the old plain Lightroom to Lightroom Classic. So it used to be called just Lightroom. Then it was renamed Lightroom Classic. So the new Lightroom is the simpler app. It's not as capable. It doesn't do as much stuff as Lightroom Classic does. The big difference is that this is a cloud-first program, meaning all of your images have to be stored online in your Creative Cloud storage. Now, the benefit of that is you can access all your images from any device. So from your phone, from your tablet, from your Mac, from your PC, because everything is stored online. You can access it everywhere. But the key thing being, every single photo must be stored online. Every single photo you have in Lightroom. Lightroom, these are management apps. They're going to let you manage your photos, import your photos from your camera, manage them, organize them, and do some editing as well. Photoshop is more for the creative side and when you can't do what you want in Lightroom. But if you're a photographer and you want to import your images, manage them, organize them, and do some working with your photos, like changing color, even doing some light retouching, then Lightroom or Lightroom Classic can work for you. It's good as a photo management tool. Now, when you hit a wall in Lightroom and you can't do what you want, that's when you bump over to Photoshop. Photoshop can do pretty much anything you want. Your creative limits are, you basically don't have creative limits. You can kind of do whatever you want, especially if you're compositing images and putting things together and doing very fine-tuned work. Photoshop has more tools than something like Lightroom. But Photoshop is not a photo management tool. It doesn't let you organize your library of photos, which is what Lightroom does. So I personally like to use Lightroom Classic. That's what I like to use. It's what a lot of photographers use because we don't want to store our vast image library all online. We might not even have enough Creative Cloud storage to be able to do that. But this photography plan, you get all 3 apps. There is a Lightroom only plan where you get only the new Lightroom and that's it. And that's if you only want that new Lightroom. So let me just do a quick demonstration here of the Adobe website here. So there's 3 photography plans if you want to get Photoshop. Now, of course, there's also the all apps plan. So if you want to get the entire Creative Cloud and get everything, you can do that. But since this is a Photoshop seminar, maybe you're just interested in Photoshop. So you kind of have 2 price points. And if you're in a different country, then the pricing, this is all US pricing. So your pricing could be different if you're in another country. But let's say, you're still going to have 2 price points here. If you get the full photography plan, but with less online storage, you're going to get the Photoshop Lightroom. That's the new Lightroom, the Lightroom Classic, and Adobe Photoshop. So you're going to get that. That's the photography plan that I mentioned. So the new Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, and Photoshop, you get all 3 apps for $10 a month. You get 20 gigs of online storage, but let's say you're not so concerned about the online storage. We're mainly getting it because we get all 3 apps. There is a photography plan that's the same exact plan, but you get a terabyte of online storage, and you pay an extra $10 a month for that terabyte instead of 20 gigs. If you're okay with using the new Lightroom only, and that's it, no Photoshop, no Lightroom Classic, you're just going all in on the cloud, then you get the 1 terabyte and you save money by skipping getting Photoshop and the Lightroom Classic. You just get the new Lightroom. So cheapest way to get Photoshop is the photography plan at the $10 a month. That's the cheapest way to get just Photoshop by itself. But if you need a bunch of apps, then probably the all apps plan is more appropriate, so you get the whole 20 plus apps of the entire Creative Cloud. So this is just focused on the Photoshop side. All right. So those are the different plans. Now let's talk about getting started with Photoshop. So let me do a live demonstration here. And by the way, for those of you who are attending live, I'm just going to copy and paste this link into the chat there. And for anybody watching the recording, I'll put this link in the video description down below the video, or if you're watching it on our blog or something, I'll put the link in the blog post. So just look around and you should be able to find that link in the video description. All right, so go ahead and go over to Photoshop. I already have it launched here, and I'm going to open up some photos to work with. Now, when you go to File, Open, when I do that the first time, it's going to ask me, okay, do I want to open up from the cloud? So you can store files in Adobe's Creative Cloud storage, or you can also open up from your computer. So if I want to open up something from my computer, which I do, I can click on my computer, and then it switches over to my computer so I can see what's there. If I ever want to switch back to Cloud Documents, I can always click back over to Open Cloud Documents to get back to that window, so you can toggle back and forth. But once you do click on your computer, if you then go in and on my desktop, for example, I've got some photos here. Let's say I open this one up. In the future, when I go to open up a file, it's going to default to that previous choice that I made. So let's say I close this. When I go back to File, Open now, since I had chosen my computer, it stays on my computer that it keeps wanting to open. So if I ever want to go back to Cloud, I can do that. The advantage of Cloud Documents are that they're accessible across computers. So there is actually a Photoshop for iPad. It's not as fully featured as the desktop version of Photoshop, but they are building it up. They had to first release it and have some features, and then over the years, I'm sure that they will keep adding more and more features to the iPad version of Photoshop. So if you have Cloud Documents, you can access it on your iPad, for example, and or your Mac. But I'm just going to open this up from my computer here. All right, so this happens to be a photo from unsplash.com. And if you're not familiar with unsplash.com, this is a place where you can get free high-quality stock imagery. Of course, if you're a photographer and you're shooting your own images, you can retouch your own images. But if you're doing marketing or design and you're looking for free, decent quality images, you could do a search here for something, or you can browse some of the different areas. So if you're looking for like people here, you can go through and take a look at different pictures of people. And if you find one you like, you can click on it and then you can download that. All of these can be used commercially for free with no attribution They always like, of course, if you say where you got it from and give credit to the photographer, but you're not required to do that. So you can use these in your commercial work. So I do like supporting photographers and giving credit here. So this photo is by Ryan Jacobson, and I actually saved a link to that so you can see this here. So this is where I got this here on Unsplash. All right, so I downloaded that image and I just clicked the download button. I've downloaded that JPEG and I just renamed it. So let's take a look at doing some retouching on that. So that's the JPEG that I got there. Let's head back over to Photoshop. First of all, zooming in and out and navigating around your document. So I can use my zoom tool over here in my toolbar, and I can drag to the right or to the left to zoom in and out on my image. What you drag in and out on, so let's say I go to her forehead, I'm zooming in and out on the forehead. If I go down to this ripped part of her jeans, I can zoom in on the ripped part of her jeans. So you put your cursor on the thing that you want to zoom in towards and drag left or right, kind of like a scrubber on the screen that you can drag back and forth to zoom in and out. Once you are zoomed in and you want to move around your image, these scroll bars are not the most efficient way to move around your file. First of all, your doc might show up there, but also just having to go left and right and then up and down. Within design apps, especially within all the Adobe apps, there are a hand tool that you can use. And the hand tool lets you just drag around any way around your image. So you can drag in any direction, you can drag diagonally, and it's just like scrolling around without you having to tediously grab your scroll bars there. These things are done very frequently, so you're going to be zooming in and out, you're going to be moving around your image, so there are keyboard shortcuts for doing those things. You can see them actually in the menu for zooming in and out, Command plus and minus on the Mac, or Control plus and minus on Windows for zooming in and zooming out. Once you are zoomed in and you want to scroll around, you can hold the space bar on your keyboard. So I'm holding the space bar to scroll around, and that way I don't have to keep going and grabbing that hand tool. I can be using whatever tool that I'm currently in, holding the space bar to drag around and go somewhere else, let go of the space bar, and I can keep working on whatever it was that I was working on. If I want to ever zoom back out to see the whole image again, I can go back and say fit on screen, and that's Command 0 on the Mac or Control 0 on Windows, and that will show me my entire image once again. All right. Now I'm going to zoom in using my zoom tool, or I could do the Command plus and minus. And in this image, there are some things that I want to get rid of. Like in the background, there's some kind of bright lights, and there's also this like little bit of red area there. And I'm just not a fan of those kind of bright lights that are here. If I zoom out and show the whole thing, like I want to focus on her, and those are just a little bit too bright for my tastes. Also, the cropping of this, I think I can actually crop off some of this stuff, but before I crop it off, I do want to just talk about retouching and getting rid of some of this stuff. So when you're working, you have to pay attention to the layer that you're on. So layers are where pixels live. Pixels are little square blocks, and Photoshop is a pixel-based program. If we zoom in, eventually we're going to see all of these little pixels that are making up our image. And by default, there's this white kind of outline around all those pixels. I'm not a big fan of that white outline. I like to turn that off by going to View and Show and uncheck the pixel grid. I'm just not a fan of that pixel grid. And that way I don't have to see those pixel grids. So when you boil an image down to its core, it's really just little teeny square blocks of color, and those are called pixels. And a layer is a layer of pixels. It's just a layer of square blocks. Now we can have additional layers put on top, but on this particular layer, there's just one set of color, like here's a color, here's a color, here's a color, and there's no colors behind it or in front of it on this particular layer. It's just whatever color I have. And the reason I make a big deal of this is because you have to pay attention to where you're changing your pixels. If I, let's say, grab my paintbrush tool, and then I come down here and I see that my foreground color is black, I'm going to be painting with my foreground color. I can come out here and I can start to make some marks. When I make that mark, it's actually permanently changing the background layer. If I were to save this file and close it, when I'd come back in, the information that used to be there under that black it's gone. It's not going to be there because I have replaced the pixels that used to be there with black pixels. So if I use my zoom tool to zoom back in, those pixels don't remember what used to be there. They changed to black. So if I save and close, there is no memory of what used to be there. Now, right now, Photoshop does have undos, so I can go in and I can say undo, but that wouldn't be there if I had saved and closed the file. When I open it back up, the undo isn't going to be there. So whenever you're doing pixel-based changes, when you're changing those things, it's actually permanently changing those pixels when you're working on one layer. You only have one color. It's either the previous color or it's black. Now we can create additional layers. So let me undo this. If I create an additional layer, then this is now a new place where I can put stuff. So I could put some black areas here. So I'll call these black marks. And I'll create a new layer here again. And these ones I'm going to call red marks. So I have some black and red marks. I'm going to go over to my foreground color and click on that foreground color and choose red. And now I'm going to make some red marks there. There's a top to bottom ordering that goes on in Photoshop. Whichever layer is underneath is going to be behind. So right now the black marks are on top, the red marks are underneath. If I use my move tool, I can move these things around as well. And I could just click on them because auto select layer is turned on. So anything I click on is just going to automatically select the correct layer and move that around. So right now we see the black marks are covering over the red marks, assuming they're on top of it. At any point, I can delete one of these layers. So if I just want the red marks, I could delete the black ones by dragging them to the trash. Or, let me undo that, I could trash the red marks. So it's through layers that we're building editability into our document. It's how we build a memory of what used to be there. And as long as you keep your layered document, when you come back to that later, you'll be able to have access to all of these different individual layers that you can turn on and off. And that if you don't like something, you can drag it to the trash and get rid of it. So when you save your file, you have to make sure that you save it in a way that supports layers for your editable file, the one that you're working with throughout your project. So when I save this, I'm going to save it to my computer. I'm not going to save it as a cloud document. So I'll say, don't show this again. I'll say, let's save it to my computer. If you ever do want to go back to cloud documents, you can always choose to save it to your cloud documents. And I will save this back into my folder here. And I will call this Dan's retouched photo. Save that. When this maximize compatibility comes up, just say don't show again. Just leave it checked on. I don't even know why they bother asking this. It should just always be left on. All right. So that Photoshop file, which I forgot to point this out. Let me just go back to save as. Notice it says Photoshop. So I'm saving it as a Photoshop file. PSD, Photoshop documents. That Photoshop file supports layers. And so all your layers that you save into a Photoshop file, they're going to be kept. You have to be careful about your file format because if you chose to save it as a JPEG, notice that it does not support layers. It says the file must be saved as a copy, and that's because it does not support layers. So only certain file types support layers, and that's why the Photoshop format does support layers, so we can come back in and work with all those. So let's say I close that, and I just realized I made a typo there, so let's put the O on there. When I open that back up, there's all my layers. All right, and it's the layers that are saved with your file. And that's how you're going to go back and make changes later on. So if you didn't like one of those marks, you could drag them to the trash and you could get rid of those things. Photoshop has the ability to undo, but those undos aren't saved with the file. So don't rely on the ability to undo as a permanent thing that you can always go back and be like, oh, I could just undo that later. Not once you close the file, it's gone. There is actually a history panel which you can use to view the last things you've done to the file. So if I look in my history under Window, History, we can see that there is a history. I opened the file, I deleted one layer, and then I deleted another layer. So while this file's open, I can go back, but this is going to be gone the next time I come to this file. The history is only while you have the file open. As soon as you save and you close the file, that history is gone. So let's say I delete the red marks layer and I save this and I close it. When I open that back up again, you're going to notice history is empty, nothing in there, and it's only what's in the layers panel that's saved. So make sure you're working with layers, maintaining those throughout your project, because that's how you're going to go back in and make changes should you need to make changes. All right, so I don't actually want that. I'm going to drag that to the trash. So all of that was kind of working up to just show the importance of layers and working in those. When I'm doing my retouching, getting rid of unwanted elements, I could work directly on this background layer, but I don't want to do that, because what if I decide to make a change later on and I don't like what I did? If I do it on the background layer, I don't have my original photo. Also, I like to see the before and the after. I like to make sure that the work that I've done is good, and I want to get perspective to compare the before and the after. So I like to leave my background layer as the original image that I'm starting to work with, and I will create a copy of the background layer to do my retouching on. And you can create a copy by dragging that down to the new icon, not clicking it, but dragging it down there. That's one way to do it. You can also say layer, new layer via copy. So Command J on the Mac or Control J on Windows, as in jump a copy to a new layer. Just boom, real quick, jumps a copy to a new layer, and now you have a duplicate. So whichever way you want to do it, dragging it to the new icon is one way to do it. And I'll call this my retouching layer, because that's where I'm going to do my retouching. And I'm going to zoom in on that. So I'm going to use my zoom tool, drag to zoom in so I can get a closer look. And I want to start getting rid of some of these things. So I'm going to make sure my retouching layer is selected. So that's where I'm working. And how do we get rid of some of this stuff? There are a variety of tools that we can use, but one of them is the spot healing brush. The spot healing brush is a great tool that works in a lot of situations at just getting rid of unwanted spots. You choose it, and then you go out here and you see if your brush is the appropriate size. My brush is too small. So up here at the top, this is called the options bar. And this is where we set options such as the tool options. For example, when I switch to another tool, I see a completely different set of options. So you first select the tool that you want to work with, and then you set its options. So I can come up here and change the size of the brush. And I want to get a brush that's close to the size of the thing that I want to remove. I don't want it to be too big, because I need to paint over the area that I want to get rid of. And so generally just a bit smaller than the thing I'm going to work with. And then I can drag over the area of the thing that I want to remove, and watch what happens when I let go. Boop. It just goes through and removes that thing. Sometimes it does an amazing job. Sometimes it just does an okay job. It depends on the thing that you're getting rid of. In this case, it's leaving a little bit of unevenness here. And I think in this case, it's hard because there's these distinct straight lines that are going across. In other areas, I think it can actually work better. So let me undo, because I do have multiple undos here. In an area like the ripped part of her jeans, I think it can actually work a little bit better. My brush is a little too big, so I'm going to go in and do something a bit smaller. There we go. And then you cover over everything that you don't like. And what you want to do is you want to get it to the point where it looks around this area and sees only goodness outside. And it basically is going to pull that goodness in and just heal that area. Oh, so cool, right? That worked amazing. This tool is really, really good. So let me undo it again. So this is the spot healing brush. With the spot healing brush, it's good at little spots. It can deal with bigger areas, but it's better at the smaller areas. You don't have to know what to put there. You just cover over the area, just darken it up, cover just a little bit past it so that when you look all the way around that whole area, only goodness exists outside of that. And when you let go, everything inside will be healed. It works really, really well. Not in every situation. It's not perfect, or else that would be the only retouching tool we had. But Photoshop does do a very good job at guessing what it thinks should be in that place. See, now I did that to the retouching layer. If I hide the retouching layer, underneath it is the original background layer. So I actually have two copies of my image, the retouched one and the original one down below. If it helps you to envision what's going on here, let me go to my Move tool, and I can select this retouching layer here, and I could just move it aside. See, I have two versions of the photo. They're just happening to sit exactly on top of each other. So when I hide the top one, I see the one that's underneath. Somebody in the chat was saying something about using CS6. So CS6 is the Creative Suite 6. It is, I think, 10 years old or more at this point. Adobe does not officially support CS6 anymore. You still might be able to install it on your machine and keep it going, because it was the last version that you could purchase an indefinite license for that you didn't have to subscribe to. Some of the things that I'm going to be showing tonight might not be back in CS6 or might be a little bit different in terms of like where things are. It's been a long time since I've used CS6. I've been using the Creative Cloud version for so long that I don't remember exactly what CS6 had and what they've added since then, because it's been so long. But when it comes to the tools, if you don't see a tool, it might be hidden underneath another tool. So you can click and hold and switch to a different tool. So for example here, maybe if you don't see like the paintbrush, maybe you're on the pencil tool or something, and you can click and hold and choose. So they kind of group related tools together. So if you're not finding the one you want, like these are like all the healing tools for healing photographs, they're all put behind one group. So you can click and hold and get to all of those related tools. All right, so let's keep working with some of these retouching features here. And while it didn't work so well to do the healing brush here, the spot healing version. The spot healing version is Photoshop guessing what should be put there. Sometimes it does an amazing job at guessing, and then sometimes it doesn't. So I could try one more time just to see if it does a good job, but I'm not super thrilled with that. It might be a little hard for you to see. I don't know how well this comes through, but it's just a little bit splotchy in there. And in this case, because the background is so smooth and it's so straight in its lines, I need to give Photoshop a little bit of help here. So for that, I'm going to switch over to the regular healing brush, not the spot. So spot is Photoshop guessing what it thinks it should put there. But I can use the healing brush to tell it what to put there. So if I use the healing brush tool, this is a two-part process. You need to tell it what you want to copy from, kind of copy from one area, and then where you want to paint it in. So I need to choose my appropriate size brush, something that's around the size that I'm working on, normally a little bit smaller so I can kind of paint around that area. Something like that looks pretty good. And it's kind of like copy, paint, and then blend. So again, this is the healing brush. I need to tell it what I want to put there. So I think something from over here would look good in this area. And so if you just click, it's going to say, hey, you can't just click. On the Mac, you got to option click, or on Windows, you have to alt click to define what you want to copy, and then you can go paste it there. I say copy and paste. It's not literal copy and paste. It's like copy and paint. I'm going to option click here on the Mac or alt click on Windows. And I'm going to go to like this line right here because I can see kind of like a line going across. And I'm going to try to line that up. So I'm going to option click there or alt click on Windows. And that defines that as the source. So I've now got that in my cursor. And then I can go paint this in. Now, as I start to paint, it's going to start blending it in right away. And I need to cover over that whole area to finish the full blending that it's going to do. And that's so much better. It's so much smoother because I got to tell it what to put in there. And I could make sure that I was going in a straight line. Let me do that again. So here, once again, I would option click on the Mac or alt click on Windows. And I would go across. And then I can start to paint. And the key is to hold the mouse down the entire time and paint over the whole area. So you cover over the entire area that you want to get rid of. And that way it blends that into the surrounding areas beautifully for you. It does a really nice job in most situations. Once again, option click or alt click on something you think belongs, then start painting over that area, completely get over all of it in one pass. So I'm holding down the mouse the entire time to get rid of it entirely. The mistake a lot of people make is they try to whittle it away piece by piece. So if they do their Option click or Alt click on Windows, they'll come and they'll just click, and they click, and they click, and it kind of works, like you're kind of blending it, but the problem is that it's trying to blend some of what it thinks is good, but it's not, into where you're painting. What you need to tell it is the entire bad area. Oops. So you really need to do it ideally in one sweep. So you need to paint over the entire thing, holding the mouse down the entire time, because you want it to be able to look around the outside area to see only goodness outside the area, and it will fully pull that in and try to blend it in. That's how you get a good job with this tool. So Option or Alt click, start painting, and don't let up until you've covered over that whole area ideally. Sometimes you might have to let up, but if you can try to do it all in one shot, you're going to get a better job if you can do it all in one shot. If it's at all possible, try to do it all in one shot if you can. All right. So now if we look at the total before and after, you can see how we've gotten rid of some of those distracting light areas in the backgrounds. I'm not going to worry about doing that one because I'm actually going to crop that off. But you can see why I like to have a layer that I can show the before and the after on, so I can make sure that I've done a good job in what I've been doing so far. All right, so now I can crop off the areas that I don't want. So I can go to my crop tool, and I can pull this in, crop this in like about so. Kind of get her in the middle. This is kind of a symmetrical shot here, so can get her kind of lined up in the middle, and that way it just gets rid of some of that extra stuff on the top that I didn't really need, and that's a better composition in this case. So I like that better. All right, and so now I've gotten rid of some of those distracting backgrounds, things that catch my eye. So now I'm looking at her face rather than the rip on her jeans and the lighter parts back there. There wasn't a whole lot of things wrong with this image. It was pretty good to start with. But there might be some kind of creative color changes that I want to make, or maybe brightness and contrast changes that I want to make with this. Let me come back and do some of those changes. I want to switch to another image to talk about working with color here. So let me open up a different image. And let's open up this one. So this is an image that I took here when I was in Maui, in Hawaii. So this was an interesting bridge, and this is a big bridge. Actually, it's not some small bridge, but it's just dwarfed by the massive Mount Haleakala, which is like 10,000 feet tall. So just small compared to everything else. And while I'm okay with the kind of composition that I've done here, the color and the contrast is just a little bit lackluster. The darks aren't very good darks. Like I want punchier darks, like contrastier darks. And the color is a little bit washed out. I could have a little bit more, maybe a little bit more warmth. It's a little cool. You know, I know the sun was out, so I want it to feel warmer, more yellowy, kind of orange. So I want to fix the color and the contrast. So for that, there are a variety of ways that we can change things. And once again, we need to pay attention to layers that we're working on here. If we're working with layers, we can do two different types of image adjustments. We can do image adjustments here, which are going to directly change the layer that we're working on, or you can do layer adjustments. Now, if you're doing layer adjustments, these are going to be done as a separate layer. For the most part, most of the things that you can do under image adjustments can also be done under layer adjustments. Not everything, but the majority of things can be done as a separate layer. So, for example, let's say I do an image adjustment here. Brightness and contrast is not you don't have the most control over brightness and contrast. Yes, you can increase the contrast, but part of the problems with increasing contrast this way is that as you are darkening up your darks, you're also brightening your brights as well. But this is just for demonstration purposes right now. So let's say I go in and I adjust the contrast. And I'm going to also really blow this out. I'm doing this intentionally because I want you to see how background is changing. Right? So if I turn the preview on and off, these are literally changing the pixels in this background layer. So if I click OK, I've changed that background layer. So that was doing image adjustments. That is a destructive, permanent change. Granted, right now when I have the file open, I could go back and undo this, but let's just pretend for a moment that I save this file and close it. When I open it back up, there's not going to be any history, and there's not going to be any record of what these things used to be. I permanently changed the pixels. And that's going to be a problem, because if I ever try to come back and get that back, I'm starting out from this current state. It does not remember how it used to be. So I'd only be darkening from here. And if I try to do that, what you're going to notice is we damage the image irreparably. We caused massive harm. So if you look at the sky, there's now these bands of color, like harsh bands of color. I completely blew out all the information that was up there. And while I could bring some of it back, I've removed so much useful information there, and my image looks horrible. Luckily, I haven't saved and closed the file, so I can go back and I can undo to go back to before that was done. See, before we had lots of information there, right? That was much better. So, moral of the story is, try to stay away from image adjustments and try to do them as layer adjustments instead. So, instead, we're going to be doing layer adjustments. So layer, new layer adjustments. And we're going to do, let's say you do the same thing with brightness and contrast. This time it's going to be done as a separate layer. And now over here on the right is where we see the settings for that. So I can crank up the brightness, I can crank up the contrast. And what was destructive before, now it's just done as a layer. I can turn the layer off, I can turn it back on. So I'm not actually being destructive with that layer. It's like putting sunglasses on, right? Sunglasses off, sunglasses on. The world looks darker, but it doesn't actually get darker. Because I can always throw the sunglasses away and the world goes back to being what it was before. So try to do things through adjustment layers. You can do this under layer, adjustment layers. You can do them here. You can also do them through the button here in the layers panel. So this little thing, I like to call it the black and white cookie because it kind of looks like a black and white cookie if you're familiar with those cookies. And so you can do things like your brightness and contrast there. And over here on the right is where you're going to see it. So normally the layers panel is stored down here off to the side so it doesn't cover over your image. And so normally when you do this, you would go to the button, choose to do a type of adjustment, and then you can see the settings right here and you can tweak it and it never covers over your image. Not only can you turn that adjustment layer on and off, but you can click on it and you can see what you did in the past. So if, for example, you blew out the highlights, well, when you come back, you're going to see that you did that. So you could just pull it back and it's as though you never did it. This is a non-destructive thing. As long as you're saving your file with layers like this, I am not harming the image using adjustment layers. So I can go ahead and save this Photoshop file. And if I close it and come back to it, my layer is there. And if I don't like it at any point, I could just drag it to the trash. And it's as though I never did that adjustment, whatever that adjustment is. So when it comes to color correcting, adjusting contrast, adjusting color, understanding some things about color will help you to truly understand what's going on in Photoshop. So for example, let me open up some demonstration files I have. And let's just do this for RGB. So these are RGB files. When we take a picture, we capture files as red, green, and blue. RGB. That's what our monitors are made of, red, green, and blue. It's what our digital cameras capture. They're the primaries of light. And understanding something about that will actually help us to understand how Photoshop thinks about color and how you can work with color in Photoshop. Okay, so imagine with me that you are looking at a pitch black room, right? We've turned out all the lights because RGB is the primaries of light. You shine a red flashlight on the wall. So it's pitch black room, but it's a white wall that you're shining a light on. So you shine the red light and you see red because you're shining a red light. Then you shine a green light, and where the green happens to overlap with red, you get yellow in the overlap. Let's say you shine a blue light. Where the blue light overlaps the red, you get magenta. And if you shine the green and the blue, you get cyan where those overlap. If you shine all three lights on top of each other, the center white area is actually the presence of all colors of light. So you're adding light. Light is brightness. And so you're getting brighter and brighter because you start with the lack of light, right? Pitch black, there's no light. Black is the absence of light. As you start to add light and add light, you get brighter and brighter. Let me show the text labels here just so you can see the red, the green, the blue, yellow, magenta, cyan, and white is in the middle. We call it an additive color process because you're adding light to get to white. The brighter you get, the more colors you add, you get closer and closer to white. You start with nothing and you build up towards white. You're adding to get to white. You might be thinking, what is this? How does this relate to color? Well, how this relates to color in Photoshop, there's actually, you'll see once we get into the interface of the color adjustments, red and cyan are opposites of each other. Green and magenta are opposites of each other. And yellow and blue are opposites of each other. This sense of opposites actually helps you in your retouching. I shouldn't say retouching, my color correction. Because if I want to make something more cool, I want it to be more towards the blue, less towards the yellow. So if you think about opposites like hot and cold, you can't be hot and cold at the same time, because if you were in the middle, you'd be neutral. You'd be neither hot nor cold. You can have hot flashes and go back and forth, but you can't be hot and cold simultaneously. You're one or the other. It's like a spectrum. It's a slider on which you're sliding back and forth. The colder you get, the less warm you are. The warmer you get, the less cold you are. So think of that as green and magenta. That's a slider between green and magenta. There's a slider between red and cyan. And when you're exactly in the middle, you're neutral. You're neither warm nor cool. You're neither yellow nor blue. Now you can go more towards the warm or more towards the cool. And I like to use yellow and blue because people understand like hot and cold, warm and cool. And so in images, you might want your colors to be warm, friendly colors, or cool, more ominous colors. In this case, I want more warmth in my image. So I want to add warmth to this. And there's a variety of ways that you can do this. There's different types of color corrections that you can do. But one that's nice to get started with is the idea of balancing color. With color balance, you can add this as an adjustment layer. And with color balance, you get those three sliders. The same three sliders that I talked about, yellow and blue, green and magenta, red and cyan. So red and cyan, green and magenta, yellow and blue. It's literally a slider right in front of you. You can go more towards the yellow or more towards the blue. And when you're first getting used to color, I encourage you to see the extremes, see too yellow, see too blue, and find your sweet spot somewhere in the middle of things. Because when you're getting used to color, your eye works against you. Like the human eye wants to see what it thinks is the correct color. Like your mind knows what colors things should be. So it's kind of telling you that you're like, oh, that's the right thing. Like, I know what that is. Like, oh, that's green. Like, that's yellow. That's brown. Like, it knows what it is, even if it doesn't look exactly like it. Like, even if it's too red or too blue or whatever it is. So you want to see too much and too little. Like, you really want to see the spectrum of color to see where's the sweet spot in the middle where you think it feels right. So if you want to make it more warm, you don't want to go too warm that it's very yellowed. And also, if you want to make it more cool, you don't want to go so cool that it looks too blue or purpley on that side. So, where's the sweet spot in the middle? And if you're making it more warm, sometimes yellowed images don't look very good. But really the sun is actually a mixture of yellow and red. So if you make something more orangey, that's going to feel more like the sun. So you actually want a little bit of yellow and a little bit of red. And especially when you're first getting started, the reason I like these sliders here is because it literally shows you the way you want to go. Like, oh, I want more yellow. Let me go towards the yellow. Oh, I want more red. Let me go towards the red. And then if I turn off the layer and turn it back on, you can see how it's making a bit of a difference in changing the color. Now this right now is just in the midtones, the middle tones. We've got shadows, which are the darker tones, and highlights, which are the lighter tones. So we can do anywhere from lights to middles to darks. And there's a lot of the image that is light, so I can also switch to highlights and do the same change there. And you're going to see a lot of change there because that's in the sunlit areas. So I can make that a little more yellow, and I'm going to mix in red because that really brings out the warmth of the sun. Because again, the sun isn't just yellow, it's actually kind of orangey. It's not just red, like it's a mixture of yellow and red. And that's really making that feel a lot more warm. So I like that warmth that's there. Now, maybe in your shadows, you could go and double down and just do everything super warm, but then you've gone too much, probably. Now, again, it depends on your feeling that you're going for here, but maybe in your shadows only, maybe you want to cool off the shadows just a little bit because shadows tend to be cooler. The sun, when it comes out in the highlights, tends to be warmer. So maybe you do cool that off a little bit. Maybe with a little bit of cyan, maybe with a little bit of blue, because those are both kind of bluish, cool colors. And that creates some kind of warmth in the sun areas and some coolness in the shadows. So it's not too overall like, oh, it feels overly warm, like in a fake way. And so it just makes the colors there feel warmer, and I like the feeling of that. That feels more like the sun's out, and I like that approach to it. So this is my color adjustment, and I've got that as a layer, and I can save this as my Photoshop file, which it is already, and I could just save that. And then if I ever want to come back and make changes later, I know that I can reopen that file up and my layer is still going to be there. So if I decide to change my mind, or if I just want to go a little further with it, I can see all the things that I've done. I can tweak those settings whenever I want because it's been stored as a layer and my file supports it. Again, Photoshop files support layers. Not all files do, especially if you're going to open up a JPEG from your digital camera. JPEGs don't support layers. You got to save it as a Photoshop file, at least when you're starting to work. Eventually, you might go back as a JPEG to post it online. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but your work file wants to be a Photoshop document. All right. So we can also do things like adjusting the contrast as well. So we can make things brighter and darker. If we're doing brightness and contrast, the brightness and contrast adjustment itself is, as I said before, it's a bit limited because when you do something like contrast, your darks get darker, but your brights also get brighter. And we don't have independent control of like what's just happening in the darks, what's just happening in the lights. For that, we can use other adjustments such as levels or curves. Let me start off with levels just because it's easier to start with. Now, when you first start with it though, and you look at it, you're like, what the heck is that? What is that mountain range thing? I'm like, I know that's a mountain, but what is that mountain over there? This is called a histogram. If you wonder what that is in written, see histogram right there, histogram. So you're like, what's a histogram? A histogram is a visual representation of how many pixels are in a certain tone. When I mean tone, I mean midtones, highlights, and shadows. So when you're looking at levels, the middle part is your 50% gray. So those are your middle tones. They're not lights and they're not darks. On the left side, where you see that black point down there, that's your blackest black all the way on the bottom left. And then on your right side, you've got your highlights. Now, I know they show these as shades of gray. That's just because of the gray interface, but this is black, 50% gray, and white. So this is your brightest white, your darkest black, and the middle tones that come in between. The higher the peaks, that means more pixels in that particular tonal range. So we see a lot of peaks here in like darker than 50%, but notice how that flat lines out, and then there's nothing in these super dark areas. There's nothing from like pretty dark gray all the way through black, and I don't have good blacks. I'm a bit lackluster in the blacks. Like I don't have a good punchy deep black. Now for the highlights, I do have highlights. Like I have nice whites. In fact, I wouldn't want to make them even brighter. I definitely wouldn't want to brighten those up. So I've got good highlights. And throughout the whole range of my image, I have some midtones, I have some highlights. You know, those are all the different tones that I have through my image. But what concerns me here is the flatlining of this dark area. And so this point right here represents the truest, darkest black. If I pull that over, look at what happens to my blacks. I'm reassigning my deepest black to pixels that I actually have in my image. Now, I don't want to bring that over too far, because if you bring it over too far, you're now saying that this and everything to the left is all solid black, and it's called clipping. You've clipped off your shadows. You've blown them out. You've lost detail. You don't want to go further than when you kind of start to see some pixels appear here. So you do want to just pull that off, like kind of pull off the dead zone. Just clip that dead zone off. And now you're going to get punchier, deeper blacks, because you've reassigned your darkest black to a pixel you actually have in your image. Before, I was wasting it on pixels that didn't exist in my image. But I'm reassigning the black and saying, that pixel, that should be black. Prior to this, it was like maybe like a 90% gray, but it wasn't true black. I pull that over, now that's nice deep black. So I'm only doing that to the darks. So my highlights still stay where they were, and I just get a punchy dark area, which is nicer. So that's the nice thing about being able to go in and adjust something it's kind of doing like a brightness contrast, but unlike the actual brightness and contrast slider, which is very limited, here you get more control. And in curves, you get even more control. We're not going to get into that today. It gets a little more advanced than we wanted to get you started with, but I will call this, I'll call it contrast and brightness. Now, as I start to get multiple layers, it would be nice to be able to hide and show all of them together. So I'd like to group these. I'm going to click on one, shift click on another to select that range of layers, and I'm going to group those, layer and group layers. And that just throws them into a group. And I'll call this my retouching and color. I know right now technically I've only done color, but normally in that group I just call it retouching and color just in case I've done any retouching in there. But technically it's only color correction. And with one click I can hide and show both of those layers in that group, so I can see the total before and after. So we can see that I've warmed up the photo and I've made the blacks punchier. So I've gotten nice, deep, dark shadows without blowing out the detail in them. So we could do a similar kind of thing for this image here if we wanted to change the color, the brightness and contrast. Now, in her case, I don't think we need an overall adjustment too much. Maybe a little bit better blacks, like they're maybe they could withstand just a little teeny bit of darkening. So let's say you go in and you do a levels on that. Maybe go just a little bit darker on the blacks. I would just go just a teeny little smidgen. And pretty much that's all I would do there. But as more of a creative thing, the background is kind of bright. And I know this is in a public space, so you can't always control the lighting, but that brightness over here is kind of distracting to me. I'd like her to be brighter than the background. So I'd like to darken up that background so she stands out against that background more. Now, everything I've done so far has just been for the whole image. Like all of these color corrections, that's the whole image that gets it, the entire thing. What if we want to do it to just part of an image? We don't want to do it to the whole thing. So that gets us into making a selection. When we want to make a selection, there's a lot of different ways you can make a selection. For example, the lasso tool would let you go in there and custom draw a selection. Now, she's a pretty complex selection, so I don't really want to try to trace her manually. So under the Select menu, there's a really cool feature called Select Subject. It does not always work, but sometimes it does. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure that I have the right layers selected. So here, this is our contrast that I did. And also, I'll call this overall contrast. So I'm going to select the retouching layer, and on that layer, I want it to select the subject matter. And Photoshop goes in and it guesses what it thinks is the subject matter. And sometimes it does an amazing job, and sometimes it doesn't. Let's close that there. If I look at it just generically, I think, hey, this did a really good job. Although when I look more closely, if I zoom in on this, it's really hard for me to see if this is a great job or not, but it does seem like it might have come in a little bit too much, and like it didn't quite include enough. So it didn't do it quite perfectly. But I'm not going to be making a massive change to this. So sometimes you have to be very careful about your selections, and sometimes you don't. When you're going to make a really extreme change, you're going to notice that line that you do there. So for example, let's say I use my selection tool here. I use my lasso. Let's say I just lasso an area. If I lasso an area and then I say, hey, let's go in and darken that. So let's say you do a levels adjustment and you lighten or darken that. Okay. So if you have a crisp edge, you're going to see a crisp, sharp edge. Now, if you just did a very soft, diffused, like soft edge, you wouldn't notice that. So let me throw that in the trash to get rid of that. So you can do a soft edge. It's called feathering. You can do that by clicking the Select and Mask button, or choosing Select, Select and Mask, either one. Select and Mask in the menu, or Select and Mask as a button. And in this mode, you can preview this on different backgrounds, so you can see what it looks like. Like let's say I go into viewing this either on a white or a black background, and you can adjust the opacity so you can see this is the area that I selected. The feather option down here, feather is like a softness. So you can make that edge very soft or very hard, which is the default. If I go in and do a very soft edge selection, it's very feathered. When I go to do my adjustment layer, it's now going to have a very soft edge, and you're not going to notice the harsh line. So now notice how I can lighten or darken that, and you barely can see that I did anything. Like, unless I do this to show you, you might not have known that I did anything there because it's such a soft edge. So as long as the edge around her is soft enough, you probably won't notice too much. Now, I don't want to make it super soft because I don't want to make it look like she's glowing or anything. Let me explain what I mean here. So let's go in and select the subject, which selects her. Then I'm going to click Select and Mask, and I'm going to zoom in on her. So I'll use my zoom tool, zoom in on her, and it did quite a respectful job. It did a really good job. Now, not quite perfect, but what I don't like is it's kind of hard. It's hard and kind of ragged over here. So that's where I'm going to feather it. And there's also a smoothness option. I could do a little bit of smoothing on there. That kind of rounds it out. The key thing being here that I just want to make sure that it's not a super hard, distinct edge, because as long as that's soft enough for the type of change that I'm going to do, this will be fine. I don't have to worry about making it super perfect. There's definitely things I could do to clean it up, but for the level of change I'm going to make, I think that something like this will be fine. All right, so now I've improved my selection a little bit, and right now she'd be the thing that I'm changing. I want to darken the background, so I'm going to select the opposite. So select inverse to get the background, because I want to darken the background. Now the background is selected, and now I can adjust the background. So let's say I do a levels adjustment on this, and I pull down. I actually want to darken the brightest bright. So if I grab this actually brightens the brightest bright. This one down here, this actually limits the brightest bright. So this actually limits and says, okay, the brightest white can be white, but now the brightest white can only be this kind of dingy gray, which actually in this case for that background, I actually want to limit that. I want to darken that down. I can also grab the midtones as well, and I can darken up the midtones. And notice that that's only affecting the background. It's not affecting her. So she's starting to pop off that background a little bit more. I think the other thing I could also do is maybe brighten her just a little bit. So I would call this darken BG as in darken background. And then I could do another one that would be lightening her. So let me go back in and reselect the last thing that I did. That restores my previous selection. Now that's the background, not her. So let me once again inverse my selection to get her. And now I could do another, let's say another levels adjustment. And let's say the midtones, I bump up a little bit and just brighten up those midtones just a little bit. Just brightens her up just a little bit. I would still keep the shadows a little bit dark like that. There we go. So just kind of pops her just a little bit. So I will say brighten her. All right. Now I've done a bunch of layers here. So I'd like to see the total before and after. Click on one layer, hold Shift, click on the top layer, and then group those layers together with group layers. This is all my retouching and color correction. Total before and after here. So removed the unwanted kind of distracting things from the background and darkened up that background so we can focus on her. So she's popping off that background now more than it was previous to this. As long as I save this as my Photoshop file, all those layers are still going to be intact. So if I ever want to close it, come back to it tomorrow, keep working on it, I can go back in, all my layers are there. The history of my file is not. That's just temporary undos while you have the file open. But at least my layers are still there and still intact. So those are some things you can do as far as the retouching goes. Now, there's a graphic side of Photoshop. What if you want to bring in a logo, add some type? So I have a Illustrator logo. I can copy and paste from Illustrator if I want. But I can also place in graphics. I can place in photos, I can place in logos, icons, things that I've gotten, that I've either created myself, somebody's given me, or that I've downloaded from online websites. So I'm going to place an embedded graphic in here. I don't want to create a link. That means I need to keep my original file around. I just want to embed the graphic into this file. So by embedding it, it means it puts it into here. So if I give you this Photoshop file, you'll have this embedded graphic. So I don't have to worry about collecting my linked files. So I'm going to embed a graphic. In this case, we have an EPS file from Adobe Illustrator. Now this could be an Adobe Illustrator file, an AI Adobe Illustrator file. I could copy and paste from Illustrator if I wanted to. But a lot of times you'll get a logo from a company and it's either going to be in an Illustrator file or an EPS file. And those are vector graphics. Those are not made of pixels. These are crisp, clean vector things. Now this is very small. This is the Vogue logo. I need to make this bigger. So I'm going to resize it to make it much bigger because this is a big photo and this was a small logo. So I'm going to make it bigger. Because it's a vector logo, I can make it any size that I want. I don't have to worry about pixel-based graphics. With pixel-based graphics, you have to worry about making them big. But with a vector-based graphic like this, you don't have to worry about making it big because when you enlarge that vector-based graphic, it's always going to output at the full resolution of this file. It's behind the scenes got mathematically described lines to always be perfect, crisp, and clean. That's why we use Illustrator to create vector graphics, to create logos, so that it can always be beautiful, crisp, and clean. With a pixel-based graphic, if you were to enlarge those pixels, eventually you're going to blow up those pixels so you see them, and you're going to enlarge them to the point where you see those, and that's not what you want to do. So we can bring in the vector graphic. We can make it any size we want with no loss of quality. If we ever want to go back and change it, we can go back into Edit, Free Transform, and we can free transform this to be any size we want. Now, Photoshop can place it here in the document, but it can't directly edit it. It can add some effects, but if you want to actually go in there and reshape it or actually change the vectors, you would need Adobe Illustrator to do that. We can actually edit this in Illustrator if we want to by double-clicking on the layer thumbnail. And by double-clicking on that, it will go over to Illustrator to make changes. Now, they do say after editing the contents in Illustrator, do a file save to commit those changes. Okay. So that's going to launch Adobe Illustrator. I can make a change in Illustrator, and it told me to do a file save. So when I'm all done, I will save the file, and those changes will come back into Photoshop. So let's say, for example, I want to change the shape of this. Now, this is Vogue, so I wouldn't be doing this normally, but let's just say I go in there and I want to pull this down. I could pull that down, and when I'm done, I say save, like it told me to. And when I come back to Photoshop, there we go. It successfully made that change. Now, I'm not going to actually make that change, so let me go back to Illustrator. Let me undo and save that. When I go back to Photoshop, it updates. You could do anything you want back in Illustrator. You could change the color, for example. Let's say you want to make this red. I could go and double click on my fill, make it red, save those changes, come back to Photoshop, and it updates the color. Now, if all you want to do is just change the color, even though Photoshop cannot directly edit the vectors, it can add some layer effects. And there's an effects button down here at the bottom. And one of those effects is to just overlay a color on top of it. So while it can't change the actual underlying vector graphic, it can just throw a color on top, overlaying whatever color was there with whatever color you want. It can also do other interesting things like add a bevel and an emboss. I like the chisel hard for something like this. And I'd make this bigger. Let's zoom in so you can see this better. I like the hard chisel. So you have to increase the size to make that tall enough. And you can change the light source. So you can have the light coming from the top, coming from the bottom. So you can kind of move that light source around and create some nice kind of 3D type. The depth is kind of the amount of contrast, if you will. If you have it very light, it's kind of not so contrasty and dark. Greater depth, you'll have a greater kind of shadowing kind of experience there. So it just depends on how moody you want that to be as to how deep you want. But let's say I do something, yeah, kind of like that. I might want to also add a drop shadow too. So I could add a drop shadow. And that one I want to push further down so I can increase my distance and increase the size, which is like the softness, to push that down. You can also even come out here and just drag your shadow around. So you can actually just come out here and drag. A lot of people don't know that. That's like a hidden thing that not a lot of people realize in Photoshop. And while I'm actually dragging that shadow around, notice that the bevel and emboss highlights are also changing. Because if you're changing this global light source, like to create something believable, your shadows and highlights need to go in the same direction. So if you change your shadow, then the shadows on the bevel need to change. So they're actually linked together so that you can create a consistent, like believable light source for your graphic that you're creating, which is cool. And there we have a nice little title added there. We can even add some type. So if I zoom in closer over here, go to my type tool, go to type. Now, whenever you're doing type, it's going to default to whatever you last did. So when you click, you might get really small text or really big text. It depends. So you got to come up here and adjust your type size to make it either bigger or smaller, depending. Also adjusting your color, which means clicking this little color box up here to change your type color. And so maybe this is the, so this is January. So the January edition. And I can make that even bigger. You can actually go to the icon on the type size and just scrub that up to make that bigger. And of course you can change fonts as well. So if you want to go in and make that more of a bold or change to a completely different typeface, you can do that as well. And go back to my move tool to move that into position. You can use your arrow keys to nudge that up and down. And then go back and view the whole thing. So fit on screen, see the entire thing. Save the file. So all of those things are editable, all your effects, all your type, all your layers. You can change any of that stuff whenever you want. So in the end, you've got an editable file, but you've got a Photoshop file. So how are you going to use this? How are you going to save the image for online use or for print or something like that? First of all, we have to understand about resolution and size. So let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about saving in file formats. I'm going to go to my Maui image here. So this was shot on, I shot this years ago on a Canon 20D, which was an 8 megapixel camera. I'm going to go into image size. I like this example because it's only an 8 megapixel camera. So it kind of gives people a realistic idea of how big can you print an 8 megapixel camera shot. So this was under image size. How big is it? What I care about here is let's say you talk about print dimensions and resolution. Right now I'm going to turn off resample. Resample means to add or remove pixels. I do not want to add or remove pixels. I want to just turn this to 300 pixels per inch. 300 pixels per inch is your ideal print resolution when you're talking about professional quality printing. So books and magazines ideally want to be printed at 300 pixels per inch. Now, if you're doing photo printing, like for an 11 by 17, you're going to be hanging on the wall. You're not always the closest to that, so you can go lower than 300 pixels per inch. But when you're talking about business cards, letterheads, books, magazines, things you're going to look at close, brochures, 300 pixels per inch is your ideal print resolution. Because I unchecked resample, resampling means to add or remove pixels. I don't want to do that. When I make a few pixels per inch, it's a really big print. The problem is, let's say you have 1 pixel per inch. Sure, you can print 2300 inches. That's huge, 2300 inches. But it's only 1 pixel per inch. So each little square block is an entire inch. That's huge. You would massively see these giant blocks of color. That's not what you want. A low screen resolution is 72 pixels per inch. But for print, we're at 300. Notice what's happening. The print size is reducing. As we pack more pixels per inch, the pixels are getting smaller. We're not adding or removing any pixels. We're merely scaling it from something huge to something small, packing more pixels per inch, making them so small you can't see them when you print. So you can do almost an 8.5 by 11 at 300 pixels per inch. So let's say I do an 8.5 by, and I've got a little extra that I can crop off. I can be 274 pixels per inch. That's really close to 300. That's going to print perfectly fine. And this is from an 8 megapixel camera. So imagine if you have a 50 megapixel camera, how big you can print. Now granted, if you want to zoom in on just a little teeny portion of that and then print that at 8.5 by 11, that's not going to work very well on an image this resolution. If you have a higher resolution, you can crop in and enlarge one area. This is the entire image that I have that I can print about 8.5 by 11. If I was going 11 by 17, so I'd have to do about like that, I'm at 206 pixels per inch, which, to be honest, if I'm putting this on my wall and I'm not getting super close to it, would probably be fine. Really, anything beyond 200, you're probably fine. The closer you get to 300, though, the better it's going to look. As you start getting lower, like 150, 72, you're going to start seeing pixels. You don't want to see those in your print. So, over 200, when you're getting down to 200, it's not going to be as sharp as it could be, but it would still probably be adequate, especially for like photo type printing. If you're doing books and magazines, though, the closer you're trying to get to 300, the better you're going to be. So 300 is your ideal kind of thing. Notice all of that was done without resampling because I do not want to fake pixels. The mistake that people make when they go into image size is they leave resampling turned on. And so then they up it to like 300. They're like, oh, I can make a 300 pixel per inch 11 by 17. Wait, where's it getting all those pixels? It's literally making them up. It is faking those pixels. And it's not going to do a great job at faking them. If you have black and you have white in between, they'll put gray. They'll just kind of even it out. But maybe it should have been white, white, black, black. Maybe there should have been a harsh, crisp edge. So everything just kind of gets a little soft and fuzzy, a little blurry when you fake pixels. So you don't really want to resample when you're increasing and increase size. You don't want to go bigger and resample because you're faking extra pixels. So rather what you want to do is see what you can actually do realistically. Go in there, don't check on resample, and see what you can do. And you're not adding and removing pixels, you're just seeing how big you can print this thing. And it'll tell you. Now you might say, well, when would you want to resample? You would want to resample when you're saving for the web because you don't need all those extra pixels when you're going to a website. So let's get to that in just a moment. So I've gone into my image size. This is a almost 8.5 by 11 at 300 pixels per inch. Let's say I'm doing 8.5 by 11. You know, I'm close to 300. That'll be good enough. So I make it my 8.5 by almost 11. No, close enough. And then if I'm saving per print, if I'm staying within the Creative Cloud, I could just save as my Photoshop file. I'm done. Because within Creative Cloud, Photoshop files are supported. You can take them into InDesign, Illustrator, Adobe XD, After Effects. Photoshop files are great. So if you're printing within Creative Cloud, like printing right now to your printer, printing through InDesign, printing through Illustrator, Photoshop files are good. But what if you're sending out to like a photo printing service? Like let's say you're going to upload this to an online service. A lot of those online services, if it's a photo printing service, they require a JPEG. So for that, what I would do is I would save as a JPEG just for the photo printing services, because most of those websites require you to upload a JPEG. So you save as a JPEG and then you can upload that. And if you're doing this for printing purposes, JPEG is really meant for an online small file. So just make sure that when you're doing it for print purposes, that you go with a large file. You might not have to go quite to the largest size because they do get really big, but don't pop down too much. Like if you're going to pop down a little bit, just maybe go down to like 11 and that's it, because you want quality over being concerned about file size. So when you're doing a print JPEG, just go with a very high quality JPEG. And only go with that if your photo printing service requires you to upload a JPEG. Go with a very high quality JPEG. But otherwise, for print stuff within the Creative Cloud, just go with a Photoshop file. Now, let's say you're going for web and you want to save out a JPEG for a website. You want a small image for a website. Well, they actually have a dedicated thing to export web graphics where you can do export as. And when you do export as, you get to create your JPEG. So you get to choose JPEG here. And this is meant to be able to reduce it down for like a website. And a lot of times when you're going into a website, let's say a developer says, hey, can you give me a 600 pixel wide image? Or let's say you're uploading to Instagram or something and they say, oh, your image is too big. So you can put in a specific size and it will cut the resolution down so that you don't have too big of a file size. Now, if you're uploading to social media, I want the high quality JPEG because social media sites, they don't accept Photoshop files. They would accept something like a JPEG, so I can upload a JPEG to Instagram, Facebook, or something like that. And to be honest, they'll res it down if you upload something too big. So social media is forgiving. When you really need to be concerned about size is if you are responsible for creating a graphic and optimizing it, and it's going to be directly put on a website with nobody else doing anything. So Facebook, they're going to optimize your image. Instagram, they're going to optimize your image. They're going to worry about file size, make it quick to download. But if you're working with a web developer and they say, hey, can you give me a 600 pixel wide version of the image? I'm going to throw it on the website. They're not going to go back in and make sure your file size is small. So it's up to you to make sure your file size is small. So you want to pay attention and work this quality down so that it still looks good, but it's a pretty small file. So pay attention to the file size here. And this is like the limbo bar of web design. How low can you get away with? You try to go as low as you can, but if you go too much, it's going to start to look pixelated and yucky. So you don't want to go too far. You start to lose detail in there. So you want to go with something high quality enough that you're keeping the detail, but you don't want to be too big of a file size. For a regular image like this, I'd say somewhere in the 60s to 70% quality would be good. I'm not going to get into low-res images versus high-res. That gets more complex than we want to get into today. So I'll just leave it as somewhere between 60s and 70s is probably good for most of your like normal resolution images. And again, you only have to worry about that if the person you're giving it to is going to directly put it into like an email or a website. They'll probably give you some specific pixel dimension, and then you want to optimize it. But if you're exporting for Instagram, if you're exporting for Facebook or something like that, if they ever give you specific sizes, you can put in the specific size. But for social media, you can go with a very high quality and then let them compress it. You don't have to pre-compress it. You can let the social media site do that. All right. But by making a smaller image, so let's say Instagram is like 1080 wide. This is going to be a much smaller file size. It's going to upload faster to Instagram. And you could do a square for Instagram, but you can also do tall or wide photos now for Instagram as well. So let's export this out, throw it on my desktop, and save my image. And I'll replace it with the new one here. All right. So for photo printing services, go with a high quality JPEG if that's the only thing they support. When you're talking about professional printers, they might actually accept something like the Photoshop file if you're sending it off to like a book or a magazine or something like that. But when it's like a photo service online, do a high quality JPEG. For social media sites, JPEGs are also good. And again, if it's a social media site, just let them compress it down for you. So that's a little introduction to resolution there of how to use your images. So we covered some things to get you started. Of course, there's a lot more to Photoshop. To get good at Photoshop, the key is to work in it as much as you can. There's a lot of things you can do. Practice makes perfect. So retouch images, color correct them, design graphics, whatever it is you want to do, just have fun doing it and do it as much as you can to get better. If you want to learn more, we have Photoshop classes and certificate programs where you can learn more about Photoshop. These are live, in-person, like hands-on classes. During COVID, if you're attending these are going to be, you can do them live online. We actually, even before COVID started, for years, we were allowing people to do live online courses, in addition to being in person in New York City, which is where Noble Desktop is based. So we do have a variety of different Photoshop courses. Our main getting started one is our Photoshop Bootcamp. That's an 18-hour class that can be done in 3 days in a row, 6 hours a day. Or if you're doing it at nights or weekends, instead of 3 days, it would be 3 weeks if you're doing it nights or weekends. If you just want a little bit of a hands-on getting started class, you could do something like Photoshop in a day. We do have a Photoshop for Web course, although I definitely would highly suggest you look at Adobe XD or Sketch. We have an animated GIFs course, so once you know how to use Photoshop and you want to learn how to create animated GIFs, we have one dedicated for that. For anybody attending live, we actually have a Photoshop Bootcamp coming up next week, actually. I think it is. Yeah, so one starting in January. But we start these classes regularly. So you'll see like this is a day class, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 9 to 5. We also have nights. So February, we have a Tuesday and Thursday night class. So that meets twice a week for 3 weeks from 6 to 9 p.m. All of these times are Eastern time because we're based in New York City. So we do everything on Eastern time. But we regularly hold these classes. So if you want to sign up for a specific area, you can. So if you just want to get started with like a 6 hour day just to get started, just to try out Photoshop, you can do Photoshop in a day. That's the first day of our bootcamp class, or if you're doing it at night, it'll be the first week of the 3 weeks. But if you know you want to dive in and do more stuff, you could just go right into the Photoshop Bootcamp, which is the more thorough class. And we do actually have a more advanced retouching class too for photographers who want to do more advanced retouching. And if you want a photo retouching certificate, this puts together our different classes into a certificate program where you can learn Photoshop, Photoshop Advanced, and Adobe Lightroom, specifically the classic version that I talked about earlier. And so that way you're kind of a well-rounded Photoshop and Lightroom user. And if you're more interested in the design side, we actually have a graphic design certificate. And in the graphic design certificate, that does, if I look at the syllabus here, that does InDesign, Photoshop, and Illustrator, the kind of 3 main Adobe apps that a lot of designers use, and also goes into graphic design concepts. So not only what you do in the apps, but like what makes good design, like typography, color, composition, talking about design concepts in here. So those are some things that you can do to further learn Photoshop. And I wish you all the best in getting started with Photoshop, and hope this seminar was helpful for you to get started.